Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bella Gamer, and this may be one of my first videos that you're watching if you're starting to get into the Paizo products with Starfinder 2E, which I gotta say, good choice, because Paizo is a great company, and as well, Starfinder is just it's shaping up to be really, really good. So this video specifically, I'm going to be talking about the Solarian as if this is the first Pathfinder slash Starfinder video the audience may be watching. Now, of course, I'm going to refer to some Pathfinder stuff for those who played Pathfinder. I'm going to try to cover my bases. And actually, speaking on that, it's also important to note that Starfinder and Pathfinder, while being incompatible systems, are not balanced against each other. So I'm not going to be comparing classes in Starfinder 2E to Pathfinder classes because they just have different balances, because the games are inherently different, even though mechanically they more or less work the same. So there you go. And I do gotta say thank you to Paizo for sending me Starfinder for the sake of review, but I'll let you know that these videos are all my own opinion and my own thoughts. And in fact, that's why I'm moving away from the Why This Class is Amazing series, as I don't need to, or awesome series. I don't need to try to convince you to play these classes. I'm going to give you the straight facts. I'm going to tell you what I like about the classes, what I dislike about the classes, and use my decades of experience in tabletop to give you the most comprehensive review of a class that I can manage. That seems to be what people like, and so that's what I'm going with. Without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about the Solarian, and I'm starting with the Solarian because it's gotta be my favorite class here. I mean, look at the iconic here. What a fancy cat boy with midriff and a bionic arm with kind of like Hotline Miami vibes with the sunset colors, which makes a total sense for Solarian, so I get it. This is just the peak of character design. I don't care what you think. This is just what peak looks like. You don't have to like it. I love it. I think the iconic is great. This is such a good design, and it really makes the Solarian feel good. So what is a Solarian, right? We're no longer in our D&D Tolkien-esque fantasy. So what classes are we even looking at? Well, the Solarian is a cosmic knight, kind of. That is how they're described, but I would say more along the lines of they are individuals who have this kind of reverence for the cycle of stars. And so they harness both the solar and the black hole. I guess we have words for solar and sun, but not anything other than black hole. But they have, fire and radiation powers as well as gravity and darkness powers. And they are a class based on going through the cycles, even though obviously the iconic that we just saw, and I'll show you again, is very much on the solar end, and with the burning finger there, that's actually a big class feature. So it's a class that I really, really like, but I do think there are some problems. But we'll get to that. Let's start off with the things, why we're here. So the Solarian is a very interesting class because it is probably one of the more melee-based classes in a game that is going to have a lot more ranged combat than other types of TTRPGs. There are guns in the setting, and guns are really, really good, and using melee weapons typically involves getting into melee range. Now, that's not to say that Starfinder is all about gunplay. It's just when you're dealing with people, which is kind of like a major theme when it comes to these kinds of settings, you're going to be dealing with people, smugglers, all that kind of stuff. And so majority of people, normal people, will use guns. But you can come across aliens, and you can come across, particular types of fighters who do prefer melee combat. So you're not going to be completely out of the rub when it comes to the more melee aspects of the Solarian. With the Solarian, though, they have a couple main features, but one of their probably most prominent features is going to be their solar weapon. So this is a big block of text and I'm just going to kind of narrow it down for you. You get to make a tangible weapon from your energy that you can manifest whenever you want. So essentially, you create a solidified version of your special weapon that has traits as indicated in this section here that you can apply to it. Though if you decide to go with the reach in two-handed traits for the weapon, then they count as 2 traits, so you only get 1 of those. Now, there are feats later on that can further augment this, but this is the full set of traits, and it's really good. I mean, honestly, parry and trip being on the same weapon is really good. In addition to this, the weapon does a D8 damage. So a D8 weapon that has 2 traits is really strong in the Paizo system, or at least as compared to Pathfinder. But this is Starfinder, obviously, and so I don't know how the melee weapons and range weapons are going to necessarily compare. So just using my experience, a D8 weapon with both like parry or trip or grapple shove, whatever, is really, really good. Also, you get to determine generally what the weapon's damage type is, though you can take the versatile trait here, which can allow you to do an alternate type of damage if you so choose. Now, when you manifest the weapon, it's going to look something like this. And I'm going to show you here another one, not the iconic, but a example build here for a gravity bug guy who looks super cool. It's called the Degradant. And you can see this kind of halberd axe weapon they have here. That is super sick. So you can make this weapon, and then every time you summon it, it is the same weapon, though you can take the reforge action to change it to a different weapon. And in fact, there are feats that can actually make this process faster because reforging typically takes around 10 minutes, which is a long time. But like there are feats for changing it if you want to. And I also want to make special mention in the weapon again here that you can change the weapon group, which weapon groups predominantly affect what the weapon does when it crits and in relation to some feats, though not for the Solarian. So the Solarian doesn't have weapon feats specifically that affect weapon groups, but there are archetypes and stuff that probably will. But I love that brawling is here because that just means you can make gauntlets, which is super cool. So I really like this. And the solar weapon highlights one of their core features, which is their attunement to either graviton or photon. So graviton specifically, when you're using your weapon, is when you successfully strike a character using your solar weapon, the creature's space and all adjacent squares become difficult terrain for that creature until the end of its next turn. That's insane because what that means, they can't take a step action in difficult terrain, or at least usually they can't. So normally when you get into melee combat with another character, you would take a step action to get away from them if you don't wish to engage in melee. When you step, you can't be struck with a reactive strike or a attack of opportunity, if that's a term you're more familiar with. With the graviton weapon, they can't step away from you, so they have to either risk getting attacked or just stay there face to face with you. And because the Solarian is a lot more melee focused, that's not a good place for a lot of enemies. So that is really cool. And the photon weapon is equally as cool as the photon attunement. Whenever you successfully strike a creature with your solar weapon, you deal an amount of fire damage equal to half your level rounded up. Your solar weapon also casts bright light in a 5-foot radius and dim light in another 5-foot. The light part isn't what you're really caring about, but the photon attune technically just does more damage. So you can see here between the two types, we have a lockdown feature with graviton and we have more damage with photon. And a lot of the general features work very much like this. But we're going to get more into that when we talk about more of their features. But talking about reactive strike, another feature that the Solarian gets right out the gate is Nimbus Surge, part of their solar Nimbus. Their solar Nimbus is just like this energy overlay that can take the form of armor. It has an aesthetic thing, which I really like, and I'm kind of like glazing over it. I just don't want this video to be forever long. But the Solarian Nimbus is like this energy field that surrounds you and can be used with some of your features, like giving you resistance and all that kind of stuff. Resistance reduces damage from certain damage types that you take, but predominantly it gives you the Nimbus Surge here that I'm showing. And the Nimbus Surge is essentially a reactive strike. It's a reaction that can be triggered whenever a creature within your reach uses a manipulate action or a move action, makes a ranged attack, or leaves a square during a move action it's using. So if an enemy is moving through your reach, you can attack them. And if they move while within your reach, you can attack them, is more or less what it's saying here. In addition, if they try to use a ranged weapon or use some kind of manipulate action, like loading a gun or something like that. So this is where the graviton attunement for your weapon really becomes strong, because at level 1, this is a feature you get. Most classes don't have a reaction like this starting out. So it makes a Solarian really good in melee combat. And if you're going for a reach graviton build, that's devastating because it's a lot easier for you to get the reactive strike off. And when you do successfully strike someone, they get surrounded in difficult terrain. And because this counts as a strike, if you hit someone with your Nimbus Surge, the surrounding area around them becomes difficult terrain, meaning that they need to spend an extra 5 foot of movement per square to try to get away from you or keep moving. So that's really good. And like everything else, this also has attunement features. So if you're graviton attuned at the time of this reaction, if that strike was a critical strike, the target must make a fort save against your class DC or become enfeebled 1 until the end of its turn. Enfeebled is kind of good. I don't like this feature as much as the photon one, because enfeebled just means that if they're using any kind of strength-based actions, they reduce those rolls and DCs by 1. Not necessarily great if you're trying to lock down super squishy ranged enemies, but good if you're fighting something that is much bigger and meaner. Photon Attune, though, is better because it has generally the same thing with a fort save on a crit strike, but it makes the enemy clumsy instead. And I like this way more because an enemy who's clumsy has less AC or armor class to be hit. So that is really good because it makes them vulnerable until it's the start of its next turn to your allies, making them easier to hit and easier to do damage to. Now, before we get to the last solar ability that they have, first I want to talk about class DC, because again, some people might be new to this. So class DC uses the key attribute of a class and your level, and you increase your general proficiency with that class as you go on. So for the Solarian, their key attribute is strength, which is really good for melee weapons, obviously. So strength is really good, and because our DCs are based on strength as our primary attribute, it makes us really good at getting our enemies failing those fort saves against our abilities, as long as we're going a very melee-based build. In addition to this, we also have a lot of hit points. We have 10 plus Constitution hit points, which generally speaking, most classes will have around 8 on average per level plus con. So 10 just gives us 2 extra HP per level above most classes. Most, not all. And so obviously this class has a lot of melee put into it. And while we're talking about this as well, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the early proficiencies you have. So starting off with our basic attack ones, we are trained in simple, martial, and unarmed attack weapons. Now, our solar weapon are considered martial weapons for all intents and purposes. And honestly, the class is very, very orientated towards using the solar weapon, which is a gripe that I'll talk about in a while. But the rest that we got here is we're also trained in both light armor and medium armor and unarmored defense, not heavy armor. Now, medium armor is good if you want to add some dex to your build, but if you want to have the most AC possible and you're going a strength build, you're going to want heavy armor. So this is a little bit of a problem. There is an early level feat to get around this, but it kind of wants the class to have a little bit of dex, and that's related to something I'm going to talk about here in a moment. But talking about our saves and perception, so we're expert in perception, which is pretty good. We're also expert in reflex and will saves, but not so good in fortitude saves. Now, this is actually really good in Starfinder specifically because there's a lot of blasts, area attacks, and weird space magics. So reflex and will, I feel like, are going to be very, very common in the system overall, but being a little bit weaker in fort saves is not going to be good if we come up against any creatures with toxins or come across like gas grenades, all that kind of stuff. So, and we could also be shoved around a little bit more, which kind of sucks for a melee-based class, but it is what it is. The overall balance, I think this is overall better considering the setting. And skill proficiencies, we are trained in athletics. Makes sense. We're a strength-based class. In addition, we have 4+ intelligence, which more often than not, you're probably not going to put that many points into your intelligence unless it's story-based. So you're going to have 4 more skill proficiencies that you can distribute as you so want. So overall, we have a class that seems very good at melee for the most part, but is not completely tuned towards it. We don't have good fort saves to deal with any of the big rough and tumble type of enemies that are going to try to push us around. And as well, we don't have heavy armor, which is a lot more orientated toward, having a lot of defense and not a lot of movement. Now, this is because the last solar manifestation that your class gets is the solar flare, which is essentially, and I love the aesthetic for this, a little mote of energy that either floats around you or is on your body somewhere. For the iconic, for instance, it was on his finger, and for the degradant we saw, it was a little floating little mote. And this little mote is where you shoot energy beams out of, essentially. So these energy beams will use your dexterity to hit, which makes them weaker overall for our offensive capabilities, but it does give us range in exchange. And with that in mind, it's something that I wouldn't say completely disregard the solar flares. They're really good. They also add your strength modifier to the damage roll. So rather than just a flat number like most range attacks do, they add your strength modifier. That means having a higher strength is good. So, and like the other features, we have Graviton Attune and Photon Attune. So Graviton Attune is a D8 bludgeoning damage with a range of 15 feet. And if you crit succeed the strike, you can attempt a trip action on the target as a free action, even if they're not within reach. It makes a lot of sense. I like how it's written here because, typically to trip an enemy, they need to be within reach and you need to have a free hand. But obviously it's this little heavy orb of energy hitting them, which is tripping them. And so it makes a lot of sense. But, players can get a little weird by it. So I'm glad Paizo wrote this out. And for Photon Attuned, we have a D6 fire damage, a range increment of 30 feet, which is twice as far. And on a crit success, they take a D6 persistent fire damage. Now, persistent damage, at the end of at that enemy's turn, they're going to take that damage and then they're going to roll a D20 and they need to roll a 15 or higher to get rid of that persistent damage. Now, there are things that can affect that DC, but it's just a flat check. So there's no modifiers, nothing. So they have a 1 in 4 chance of getting rid of it, which means the Photon Attune technically can do more damage, at least with a single crit strike, over the Graviton Attuned because it deals an additional D6 persistent fire damage on top of it. Really cool. And obviously by how the iconic was set up, you can tell they use this, the photon range strikes a lot more. So this is kind of like the major part of the class that I think people are going to rub kind of raw against. So obviously it's a melee-based class. It has strength as its primary stat, and it's got really good features for strength weapons, and it's got good features to keep enemies rooted next to them. And then we have this solar flare thing here, which just seems like a good alternate strike if we can't get to an enemy for whatever reason. Well, there's lots of features and there's lots of specific feats that are designed to play a ranged Solarian. So you can play a full ranged build if you want to. So don't ignore the solar flare. It does some really cool things with its feats. And a lot of people don't like a class that has a lot of stat requirements. If you wanted to go a flex build with melee and ranged, well, then you're going to need strength, you're going to need dex, and you're going to need as much con as you can get. And that's a lot of stats you really need to worry about. So This class is going to irritate some people, and some other people are going to absolutely love it. That's just how it is. For myself personally, I don't care if I have a stat that's a little less optimized than others. I prefer to play a character in the most fun and interesting way possible. And so I like this, but I admit that some people are just going to not like the solar flare or just completely ignore it, which I think they're really missing out. Now, beyond these core features that you all get at level 1, which gives them a pretty nice kit starting out at level 1, there are a few features I want to make special mention of. First of all, and for the Pathfinder 2E players out there, something I found very interesting is at 3rd level, you get Stellar Resilience. Now, this is a normal feature that you're probably familiar with, where your fort save will increase to Expert, and that's about as high as it gets. But unlike in Pathfinder, in Starfinder, and this is common across all the classes, they get a bonus success feature, which you normally in Pathfinder, you only got for your highest saves. But in this one, you get it even for your lower saves. So for Stellar Resilience, for instance, when you roll a success on a fort or will save against a mental or incapacitation effect, you can attune as a free action, which is kind of cool because attuning can change your resistances in some situations. It can help you with your solar Nimbus. So that's really cool. And that's very unique to Starfinder. So you're going to see that for all the classes. They're going to get something for their weaker save, which I actually think is a really good change. And it makes it very interesting. The ability to attune, which if you're unfamiliar by now, attuning changes if you're in graviton mode or photon mode. So I think that's a really cool feature. And speaking on cool features, Stellar Senses at 7th level is also really cool, especially if you're thinking, if you've played Pathfinder, because at this level, you get a +2 circumstance bonus to your initiative rolls. Now, that's not necessarily unique. Fighter gets that in Pathfinder 2E, but what's really cool is if you have the Incredible Initiative General feat, which gives you a bonus to your initiative, the bonus increases to +3 instead, which makes the Solarian have a really good initiative, especially because they start off with a expert in perception and get to master by 7th level, which is really good. That means Solarians are really good to act fast in combat, and so you're going to want, I think, a little bit of wisdom, or whatever wisdom you can fit into your kit, essentially. Because the sooner you get to act, the sooner you get to position, and as a melee character in a mostly ranged kind of setting, that's incredibly huge. So again, some stellar design choices here by Paizo. Now, like most classes, the Solarian will get master expertise in its armor and its weaponry, except at 19th level, they get the Stellar Paragon feature, which increases their solar weapon and solar flare proficiencies to legendary. That's huge. In Pathfinder 2nd edition, the fighter was pretty much one of the only classes that got a legendary weapon proficiency in general. And it was only it was for pretty much all weapons. Now, the Solarian is not quite as impressive, but their solar weapon and their solar flare are going to be some of their most kitted out features anyway. So this is actually really, really good. Now, this though brings up a gripe I have with the class. And it's not necessarily the class is bad kind of thing, but one of the hardest things you're going to have for a Solarian character, whether you're a GM or as a player, is if your team finds a really cool weapon, at some point, granted only at 19th level, to be fair, and so it's not like anything that's going to majorly affect how you play the game, but at 19th level, you're going to just be better with your solar weapon and your solar flare than whatever magic weapon or modified weapon you can find. And that's for both ranged and for melee. So you're going to come across a lot of situations where you're just going to come across a thing that's like, oh, this is really cool. I wish I could use this, but I'm just better with my solar weapon and solar flare. And considering they have so many feats and features orientated around these two things, it makes it really hard to really want gear outside of what weapons you are already provided. And I guess I should mention at this point that Solarians do have Solarian crystals. Now, Solarian crystals more or less act as, if you're familiar with Pathfinder, they act as your basic runes for weapons. So the higher level of the Solarian crystal, the bigger your bonus to hit with both your solar weapon and your solar flare, which makes this particularly good because it is essentially a rune that affects both a ranged and melee weapon simultaneously, so super cost efficient. It also increases the number of dice that you hit with. And in addition to this, they get orbital crystals, which act more or less as property runes that allow your solar weapon and your solar flare to do other things. For instance, like the gluon here, I really like this one. It allows your solar weapon and your solar flare to deal an additional D4 persistent bleed damage, and on critical hit, the target is clumsy until it recovers from the persistent bleed. That critical hit effect is insane because that clumsy means they are weaker to, their AC is lower, and they can't dodge as easy, making them very vulnerable, and they can't get rid of it until they get rid of the persistent bleeding effect, which they only have a 1 in 4 chance of getting rid of on each turn, which is really, really rough. So the Solarians have a thing that can be loot that they can get that is nice. But overall, this is just a thing that I feel like some people are going to kind of rub rough against because it makes one of the core aspects of these games, the loot gaining part, a little less interesting. Now, armors are still things you can pick up, but, you know, I just wanted to make mention of it. I don't think this makes the class weak in by any means, and for all intents and purposes, their solar weapon and solar flare are just going to be stronger than most other choices, but just be aware that that might be the thing that happens to your character. It doesn't have to be. You don't have to select those feats, obviously, but it's where the class really shines, honestly. All right, now that all the general class features are done, let's look at some of the feats. I'm not going to go through all the feats because this would make the video an hour long, and it did make the video an hour long before I reshot this video. So most classes have certain feat lines or certain feat themes where the class kind of works in certain directions. So for the Solarian, for instance, they have a solar flare line, which just is all about the ranged features of their solar flare. They have some good melee options like Stellar Rush, for instance, here, which just makes you really, really fast and is great for initiating on enemies. And in addition to this, depending on whether you're graviton attuned or photon attuned, when you finish your strides, something happens. Graviton attuned, you create a giant magnetic pole, essentially, or gravitational pole that enemies need to make a fort save against your class DC, or they're pulled directly towards you to an adjacent square as long as they're within 15 feet of you. You explode into light, which creates this little like light dome that any creatures inside or outside of the dome become concealed to each other. So you create this dome and enemies have a harder time shooting you because they can't see you clearly. Or you can run up to an enemy and explode on them, and other allies don't know what's going on as there's this big light dome in the middle of the battlefield. Both really, really cool. But as I was talking about before, this is very much based on a more melee feat line. And then there is the Solar Shield line. Now, the Solar Shield is nothing super impressive. It is more like a buckler than it is like a full tower shield. And it doesn't really get that much bigger, but it is really nice. And especially if you want to go a very heavy melee sword and shield kind of route. And there's some really cool feats that go along with it that we'll talk about here in a moment. But what the Solar Shield is you can raise the shield as an action to give yourself a +1 circumstance bonus to your AC until the start of your next turn, and you also gain the Shield Block General feat. Shield Block allows you to use the Shield Block reaction, which reduces damage you take based on the hardness of your shield, and this shield scales with you as it has a hardness equal to half your level rounded up. Though that's not a lot of damage. So at level 1, it's 1. At level 3, it's 2. It does scale, but very slowly, and 1 to 2 damage off is not anything great. It also has a number of HP equal to 5 plus twice your level, which is decent. It means it could probably take 2 hits, more or less. But once it breaks, you can't use it again for 10 minutes. So an action to get a little bit of an AC bonus and to mitigate a little bit of damage potentially if you choose to use your reaction, which means you can't use your Nimbus Surge necessarily. and then it breaks pretty easy. It doesn't sound super good, but it actually has features designed around the fact that it breaks. So if you're graviton attuned, you can see here that an adjacent enemy must make a fort save against your class DC or be suppressed for 1 round. Now, suppressed is a new condition which reduces the attacks of the target being affected by the suppress. So they are less likely to hit, and for graviton attuned, this is really good, though it depends on the situation. If the enemy is hitting you and you're using your shield and then it breaks, they might not hit you again, depending on, what action broke the shield, and they might even just miss you anyway with a second attack because of that multi-attack penalty. So not so good. But if an enemy is shooting you while you're in melee combat, this is really interesting, because then when your shield breaks, you can apply this to an enemy adjacent to you, meaning they have a harder time hitting you with your shield that is now gone and not providing you your AC bonus. So that's pretty cool. Now, photon shield is also pretty good. When it breaks, an adjacent enemy must make a fort save against your class DC or become dazzled or blinded on a crit failure. So dazzled just makes you concealed, which means they need to make a flat check to hit you. Blinded is the same, but much more difficult to hit. You need to roll a much higher number, more or less. So photon is really good against a melee target, because when you are concealed, you can also technically take a hide action against that enemy, becoming effectively invisible to them if you succeed. So very, very interesting. The Solar Shield is probably not the strongest feat line, if I'm going to be super honest. Now, you can stack this with Solar Rampart, which gives you heavy armor training, and it makes heavier armors have a lighter bulk up to or down to a minimum of 1 bulk, depending on how heavy the armor initially was. And whenever your armor proficiency increases, your heavy armor proficiency increases. So if you want to be the most damage resistant you can be, having a shield plus Solar Rampart gives you a high AC with the increased AC from raising your shield, and then you have some extra damage mitigation. And because the armor is a little lighter, it doesn't punish you so much for all the equipment you're currently carrying. But I don't think that's necessarily a super big part of it, but it's a part that's here. So earlier I talked about the solar flare feats, right? So let's talk about some of those. So hampering flare is one you can pick up at level 1. It's really, really good. It's a singular action, and it has the cycle trait and flourish. So flourish means you can't use another flourish action this round. That is not usually a problem, but because this is a 1-action flourish, that might feel a little unfortunate, because you have other really good flourish actions you could be using during that turn. But hampering flare is really good, especially because when you make a range strike with this attack, if the attack hits, the target is off guard until the start of your next turn, or until it takes cover, whichever comes first. Meaning just hitting with your normal solar flare attack is going to reduce their AC by 2 because they're off guard, making them incredibly vulnerable to be hit and be crit by your allies and by any additional strikes you make that round. Very, very good. Now, it has the cycle trait, which I also mentioned before. The cycle trait changes your attunement after you use the action. So this is something you have to be very aware of when it comes to many of the Solarian feats, because maybe you want to play a photon build where you want to be cool, shooty laser cat boy from the Iconic, right? Well, every time you would use hampering flare or another cycle feature, you would then become graviton attuned. A very smart player can use this ingeniously to mix in abilities of differing attunements to get the most bang for their buck in a round. But a player who just wants a very simple hit things, do stuff kind of build are going to get frustrated by the cycle feature, because they're going to get out of their preferred attunements. Now, there are some ways around this, and at level 18 or 20, is it? At 20, you can become perfectly attuned, which just means you're considered being both graviton and photon attuned at all times. But that's level 20, and that's a level that most people don't get to nor play that long in. Regardless, hampering flare is a really good feat, because making an enemy off guard makes your next attack more likely to hit and makes that enemy very vulnerable to your allies. So if you're going a full range build, that's an insanely good feat to pick up. Another really good feat to pick up if you're going a Solar Flare build is Unstable Flare. Now this one you get at level 14, but it's definitely worth it because you make a Solar Flare strike at every enemy in a 15-foot burst at a -2 circumstance penalty, which is really, really strong. Sure, you're less likely to crit. It's not your most optimal accuracy, but you could hit a lot of enemies in a 15-foot burst. Striking even 3-4 enemies is super damage efficient for 2 actions especially, and as well is just really, really cool. You just flick your little mote into a group of enemies. Now, this does have to be within your mote's first range increment, which is easier for Photon than it is for Graviton, and I'll mention an additional feat about their ranges here in a moment, but that's really good. It's like a grenade. You can essentially make a grenade attack with your solar mote, which is super cool. I actually really love it aesthetically as well as just mechanically. But this feature also has another unique trait called Disharmony. Disharmony makes your character unattuned, so you lose your solar weapon, shield, whatever, after you use this ability, benefiting from whatever attunement you are in, which does actually affect Unstable Flare until the ability is done being used, which means Unstable Flare, you can really consider being 3 actions rather than 2, as you're going to need to take an additional action to attune. Now, there are some feats that make getting attuned a lot more easy, but it's just something you should be aware of when it comes to feats with the Disharmony trait. Now, if you're Graviton attuned when you use this feature, you can stride up to half your speed once as a free action immediately before or after making your attack, which is actually really good because Graviton attuned, your range increment is often smaller. So this allows you to run up and use this feature, which is very action efficient, or you can throw it and then run away because you're about to become unattuned, which is also pretty good. With Photon attuned, you're concealed to each target of this attack until the start of your next turn. That's also a really good feature considering the Disharmony because it makes it more difficult for them to hit you as they just have a flat chance of missing you because you're concealed. So Unstable Flare is really cool, but it can have some pain points if you're not paying attention to the traits. Now, I did mention a feat earlier that can extend your ranges for your Solar Flare. Distant Flare is a level 2 feat that you can pick up that increases the range increment of your flares by 15 feet. Really, really good for Graviton and pretty good for Solar Flare as it gives you an extended range. Now, on the melee end of things, we have something like Binaric Assault, another level 1 feat that's really good. And now this one is technically a ranged and melee strike, but in practice, it's actually just a melee strike because they both need to be against the same target, and obviously that means they need to be within your melee range in order to hit. So you make 2 strikes at the same target, one with your solar weapon and one with your solar flare, each using your current multi-attack penalty. So if you're fresh, you haven't used an attack this round, they're at your max ability to hit, which is really good. Now you can make these strikes in whatever order you desire. So if you have a feature that might affect how one would work over the other, that's something to keep in mind. And after the first time a strike hits, resolve the damage and effects, then swap your current attunement. If both attacks fail to hit, you become unattuned. So this is really interesting because you would hit with a Graviton weapon to slow the enemy down, and then you would swap to your Solar Flare, which is now Photon attuned to hit and possibly crit, making them take the persistent fire damage. So this is another really big brain feat that if you're a very intelligent player, you could use in very interesting ways. Now, it does have a pretty devastating downside if you miss with both attacks. You become unattuned, and considering this is a flourish, that's a big gamble. But it's not very likely. Unless you're attacking a boss enemy with just really high AC, you're very likely to hit with one of these 2 attacks as long as you're using your full attack ability to hit. Now, this counts as 2 attacks when calculating your multi-attack penalties. So if you were to make another strike after Binaric Assault, then that would be at your 3rd attack penalty, typically a -10 to your attacks. So Binaric Assault is really good, very damage efficient, and if you're in melee specifically, a very devastating effect. But another feat you can select at level 1 that I think you should very much consider is twin weapons. Twin weapons is insanely cool because when you take this feat, or whenever you reforge your weapon, you can choose, you get a second weapon, so you can dual wield solar weapons, kind of cool, and you gain access to 2 new traits. You gain access to Agile and Twin. Agile means that multi-attack penalty is reduced for that weapon, and in addition to that, Twin gives you an additional benefit when you're striking with one weapon after the other. And the great thing about this is you can choose the traits individually. So they don't have to both be agile. You can have a harder, bigger hitting weapon in one hand and a more agile, lighter weapon in the other. And agile doesn't even reduce your damage, so they would technically both do the same amount of damage anyway. But it just means that if you have a trait you would prefer on your primary weapon, you can just add agile to the secondary weapon because that's the only one that would apply to the multi-attack penalty. Also, really, really good, and agile is insanely good on a D8 weapon. So yeah, we got some really good melee choices right here at level 1. In addition to that, we also have Rampart that I mentioned before that can give you heavy armor. We also have feats like Solar Wind. Solar Wind is really cool, but it only works while you're photon attuned, so that's something you need to keep in mind. But while you are photon attuned, you don't need to spend any special actions or anything. You just have a plus 10 circumstance bonus to your speed, and you can move through the space of a single unwilling creature one time each time you stride. This is insanely good if you are diving into the enemy backline. You're not only just faster, but in addition to that, you can move through an enemy space each time you stride. It doesn't even say you take the stride action. So for Stellar Rush that I mentioned before, it mentioned you stride twice. So during that movement between the strides, you can stride through 2 enemies, allowing you to definitely get into the backline. Now, I will state specifically, Stellar Rush gives you a circumstance bonus as well, which doesn't stack. So you would lose technically the speed aspect of one of these 2 features, but I think that's completely fair considering with Solar Wind specifically, moving through enemy spaces is very, very good just as its own feature. Normally, you can't move through an enemy space unless you take the tumble through action, which requires you to have a really good acrobatics and which means you'd have to have a really good dex. Solar Wind gets around that while allowing you to be a very strength focused character, which is really, really good. Now, I gotta say, though, they also have just a lot of cool magic-like effects that they just act like magic that they can have as additional kinds of features. My favorite is Constellation Vortex. So you manifest a copy of your solar weapon that swirls around you in this vortex, leaving behind a constellation of patterns in its wake. Insanely cool visuals. Now, a creature that starts its turn adjacent to you takes damage equal to the amount of damage dealt by your weapon with a basic reflex saving throw against your class DC. Now, this is a sustained action, so to keep this going round after round, you do need to spend an additional action, but every time you do so, a new weapon is added to a maximum of 3, and every time a new weapon is added, you increase the damage of this by 1 per weapon swirling around you in the vortex, including the first one. So you do your weapon damage plus number of weapons swirling around you in this vortex. And in addition to this, if you're graviton attuned, it's actually 2 damage per weapon. And if you're photon attuned, it's 1 fire damage per weapon, which means with graviton, it's 3 damage per weapon. And with photon, it's 2 damage per weapon, but one of those is fire, which can be good for enemies that have fire weakness or some other kinds of beneficial effects for dealing fire damage. And this feat has a different type of feature which increases as you level. So every time you level 3 times for this one past the initial feat level, so at 9th level, 12th level, 15th level, the damage increases for each additional weapon by 2 if it's graviton attuned, or 1. Oh, I'm sorry. It increases by 2 base, and increases the extra damage from your attunements by 1, which is absolutely crazy. So at 9th level, on top of the fact that your weapon is more than likely dealing 2, maybe even 3, not likely, but maybe 3 weapon damage die, you are dealing in Graviton specifically, you are dealing, well, what is it? It's a lot of math here. So it's 1 plus 2, 3, and then Graviton is 2 plus 1, 6. So you're dealing weapon damage plus 6 extra damage every time the enemy fails their save, or half that if they make a success, because it's a basic reflex saving throw. That's a really cool feature. Just dynamically, it's very interesting. It looks really cool. It makes you a swirling vortex of doom on the battlefield, and it just looks really, really cool. So that is it for the Solarian, or at least for this video. There's still a lot of really cool feats they have. Definitely check it out. You can check out Archive and Nethys. They're going to have a Starfinder 2E page soon. The game hasn't fully come, or will be fully coming out about the time this comes out, but usually it takes Archive and Nethys a little bit of time to make it out. But you can get all the rules essentially for free, which is really, really cool. And Paizo supports this. And in addition to that as well, I'm going to be making some more videos. So if you are interested in Starfinder content, if you thought this video was really well done, then please go ahead and like the video and subscribe. It really helps the channel out. In addition, if you want to see the content, if you want to see the classes that come out, or any new classes that come out, you're going to want to be subscribed to this channel. But in addition to this, I want tabletop to succeed. So if you're watching anyone's content on this kind of stuff, please leave a like on those videos. I want to make sure that we are amping tabletop in the algorithm as much as possible, and this summer is going to be the best time to do it. For my overall thoughts on the Solarian after my spiel, I think the Solarian's really cool. I think aesthetically, Paizo did a really bang up job. I think they also just mechanically really nailed this class. It does have some disharmonious traits, though, that I think some people are going to rub up against. I think the fact that Solar Weapon being or Solar Flare being such a big part of the kit is going to be dex-based to hit, even though it's strength-based for damage, is going to annoy some people because people just want to have their best stat do all the things. But I think the class would be broken if that was the case. So I think it makes a lot of sense. And the fact that the class doesn't have heavy armor, for people who really want to get into the knight aesthetic or really want to play a heavy armor version of this class, they're going to get a feat tax needing to pick up Solar Rampart at level 2. Is that a big thing? Not really, but some people are still going to be kind of annoyed at that when this is supposed to be essentially one of the melee classes. Now, granted, it is Soldier also is a melee class, but it's also a range class. It depends on your particular build with Soldier. But Solarian definitely wants to be in melee range. And so there's just some things that people are going to rub up against. But if you like a class that has all the aesthetic, has the coolest features in the game, is a more impressive Jedi than Jedi were ever in Star Wars, I think Solarian's going to be for you. But if you don't want to think too much about how you're playing the class, if you don't like how the attunements swap or anything, which is completely valid, I think you're going to want to go the Soldier route if you're wanting to play a more melee build. And that's just my opinion. But I don't know. Let me know your opinions down in the comments below. Thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me. Stay tuned. More Starfinder is coming. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye.